All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Well-Rounded Fool, an exploration of atrocity. Thank you for everyone for tuning in to the first episode that we did last week, titled Exhibiso. That's when we, that's when we went into the whole entire introduction of this and what this lecture series is about. What the well-rounded fool meant, that archetype. We talked about Socratic humility. We spoke about the significance of understanding where you are on that spectrum of being humble in your intellectual capabilities and understanding when that process of intellectual prowess can be corrupted, can become pathologized. We spoke about how in history, times when intellectual prowess and ideology combined, and how that led to, or how we're going to talk about how that eventually led to, well, the deaths of millions. And we also covered briefly on certain mechanisms we can use to keep the intellectual capabilities at bay, and to not mistake our wisdom, our intellect for wisdom. But to further reiterate what this entire series is about and what the well-rounded fool is, today we're starting the next portion, which is going to combine what we did last week and talk about these new beginning subjects, because things start to arise when we talk about evil and malevolence, and we speak about how people become corrupt and deception. We're going to go over deception literature as well further on in this series. But what we talk about doesn't cover it enough. There's deeper things that are underlying, well, what's wrong with deception, or what's wrong with being an arrogant asshole in your intellectual spirit. What's wrong with that? So we're going to talk about today, and what this episode is titled, episode, lecture, whatever you want to call it, is we're going to talk about reality, consciousness, and the necessity for truth. That word truth has become increasingly attacked within the recent century and within the recent months and years. So we're going to talk about truth, consciousness, and reality today, because those three things I feel as encapsulate it's a good place to start. So what is reality? We go through life, and maybe this seems mundane or self-explanatory, but a lot of things, once you really start to, the purpose of exercises like this and the purpose of educating yourself isn't to make things more complicated. It's just to show you the same exact thing from a different perspective. So when we talk about things as truth and consciousness in reality, those things do come off as, well, reality is just, I just look at the world and there it is, it just appears itself. When we talk about truth, it's like, well, I can say X, Y, and Z is true, and then you just understand that just a priori. Not quite. It's a lot. It's not that straightforward. It's not that straightforward. In the very process to make the see, when we're talking about the things as truth and reality and consciousness, these things are at the bottom of literally everything. Our life, how we interact with other people, how we interact with ourselves, our self introspection, the very idea of there being a reality that we all can inhabit, we all can share, and that we have to participate with other people. That very concept is beyond every man's conception. No one can understand what is going on right now. We're on this floating rock in the middle of and surrounded by billions and trillions of random atoms and matter. Like, who knows what is going on right now? And when you abstract and look at it that way, that could perhaps be enough to make you at least question these fundamental realities, these fundamental truths, what consciousness is. And when you fail to investigate these things thoroughly, not to deconstruct them for its own sake, we're also going to talk about which occurred during the 20th century, rising in the 19th century. The idea of just deconstructing these deeper concepts for its own sake, to say that there is no such thing as a reality, or there is no such thing as truth, or even worse, implying that the investigation of reality, consciousness, and truth itself is so that you can use that to promote your own political agenda, which is even a worse doctrine in and of itself. These things are at the bottom of everything. And the reason and the purpose of this exercise is to simply investigate in a philia sophia nature, a philia sophia manner, which is to love wisdom. Is to love the wisdom itself. Is to come into a state of uncertainty and to come out with a better understanding. So that's what we're doing today. So how about we start with reality? What is reality? Well, we're kind of just thrown into this thing called life. That's what the existentialists call that, the thrownness. We just kind of just tossed into this thing that we call life, and we're kind of forced. It's kind of forced upon us what this whole entire thing is, and what we know, what we see, what we feel, what we touch, our senses. We're sort of limited to those senses in a way of what a reality is. You know, like we think that just because we see something, that means that it exists. Like, what is the criteria for something to exist? Is it the fact that I can see it? Is it the fact that I can touch it? I can smell it? I can witness it? That purely an empirical evidence? Does that indicate the marker for something existing? If you say yes, then okay, then you're going to have to explain in which. And this was a big problem that came up, particularly during the Enlightenment, when science and religion were fighting. We were throwing away these deeper fundamental philosophies and moralities that were guiding society for millennia, and we were combating this with a rugged empiricist way of viewing the world. You have to understand that. So what was accepted for thousands of years was, if something were to exist, it's something that you participate in. It's something that has an own essence in and of itself, in a Platonic way, its own being. That's what Plato called his I think it's called Entelechy. Entelechy, maybe pronouncing that wrong. The Entelechy is, for something to exist, it has its own form. It has a purpose. And the example that Plato used was the seed of the oak tree. That was something. For something to be is it has a form. So there's a couple of things that Plato required for something to exist, for something to be a being in and of itself. It has to have a form, and it has to have a purpose, a divine purpose, a determined purpose, a telos, to use that word. That was a criteria for something to exist. So the oak tree has this form because that form in and of itself is compact with the capabilities to be placed in the ground and to be nourished by other natural resources and to flourish into its telos, to its purpose, as a purpose. And for Plato, and for a lot of those philosophers, for a lot of those thinkers, pre-Stoic thinkers, because he was a pupil of Socrates. I'm not sure if he was a Stoic or not, but he was one of those people in take on that. For those people, the idea of something existing, existence and purpose, in and of it, kind of weren't separated in a way. If you think about it, the reality of something, the reality in its purpose, in its telos, those things were not thought of to be in a more modern scientific way to be separated. You know, if you had a purpose, then your purpose was your reality, and your reality was your purpose. You had a divine reason why you were created. You were created. Now, they weren't believers of. This was still during the Hellenistic era, so they weren't a believer in like the Judeo-Christian model of God having a intrinsic good for existing. They weren't playing that game, but they were playing the game of having something having its. It was a focus on being divine. It was a focus on having a purpose. So you can think of reality as a purpose. You can think of something being real. There is nothing more real than something that has a meaning, that has a purpose. Something that Jordan Peterson talks about a lot. He's really popularized this idea of, well, what matters in life? What matters? What is matter itself? And he thinks that, well, matter, not like this is matter, a table, this blackboard doesn't matter, my shoes, these Nikes are a matter, but what actually matters? What is the fundamental reality that ties it all together? Well, he thought the things that what matter is what actually matters. Is the things that have that purpose, that call themselves out, that has that intrinsic reality, not something that was pre-constructed in an ideological way that has some sort of twisted and instrumental means, something that is intrinsic. Like, how do you explain love? How do you explain jealousy? How do you explain resentment? How do you explain missing someone? These things, these fundamental realities cannot be scientifically observed. They cannot be scientifically tabulated and calculated under a microscope in a petri dish. And this is what science was failing to explain. This is what even the philosophy of science was failing to explain these things, which later the failure of science to explain the deeper fundamental realities of life, that is what led, and that is what is still leading to the rise in scientism. Scientism is the religion of science, is when science itself steps out of its domains to explain what is this table, to jump headfirst into why this table ought to be here. And that's not what science is for. That's not what science is for at all. So you can think of reality as the things that matter. That's why I think it is. You don't have to think that, but as far as for the sake of this exercise, for the sake of this series, we can think of reality as something having its own intrinsic meaning, having its purpose, having its entelechy, its telos in a Platonic way. Something having its purpose. It may have been Plato or Aristotle. I may have really messed that up. But it's just to think about something as being fake. Like, what is something that's fake? A fake smile, a fake laugh, something that you made a representation of something else. Even the fake things are real in a way because someone had to make that fake thing. Someone had to think about how to make that fake thing a reality so you could see it, so you could view it, so you could have a certain reaction to that thing. So even the fake things in and of themselves have a certain Aristotelian Platonic meaning encapsulated inside. Even the fake things in life, when you make a fake gesture or you make a fake thing or you call yourself a fake name, it's like, okay, well, that's not really your name, but it's not the thing in and of itself that's real. It's what's real is the purpose, is the telos of that thing. And that's not something that you lay down in an empirical scientific way. That's not something that you can tabulate in a scientific method. It's something that you have to participate in. That participatory knowing, that's something that's Brevet is really popularized, that we're going to have a whole episode about. That participatory knowing, that propositional knowing, that procedural knowing. These deeper levels of understanding reality, understanding the epistemology of knowing itself. So we just talked about reality. What is reality? It's the things that matter. It's the things that pronounce themselves to you. But what is necessary in order to obtain that reality? What is necessary? What's the precondition to judge and to be the jury of that outside stimuli? What is necessary for that? We have this idea of consciousness. I had a talk with my good friend Caleb Kennard. We talked about consciousness a lot. I'll leave a link to that video somewhere over here. So what is consciousness? There has to be some sort of conscious agent. There has to be a conscious agent to interpret that reality itself. So what is that? A fair guess would be no one in their goddamn mind knows what consciousness is. And any person, any scholar who claims that to know the definitive definition of what consciousness is a complete liar, because, well, how can you know? You can never come to know the mechanism in which you use to know. You can never become aware of that. You hit the homuncular problem. The homuncular problem came up in Kant's work as well. So the homuncular theory is homuncular means little man. So the concept and what Kant argued was that there cannot be a solid definition. There can't be a one causal function for the mechanism you use to understand mechanisms. There has to be some sort of dualistic process, like the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere. There has to be some sort of, or a this party or a Democrat party. There has to be two things that opponent processing. There's something else John Vervaeke speaks about a lot. There has to be some sort of process that is self-organizing, that can interpret things, that can be interpreted itself. So when we think about consciousness, when someone tries to say, well, this is what consciousness is, it allows us to see. It's like, okay, so what allows us to see then? Okay, well, it's consciousness. You get into this infinite regress. Because who is the little man? Who's controlling the little man inside? Who's controlling this guy? Who's up here organizing what content? Who is controlling him? Well, you say, okay, well, there's another little man in him. Okay, so who's controlling that little man? And then you just keep going and going into this infinite regress. So we hit that problem. And people have attempted to explain that problem. There is one process. I'll try to keep this very basic, and just a minute again, I'm not going to overload you people just like that. There's been different things put forward: the parasympathetic system, the sympathetic system, and these two systems are constantly pulling and retracting your attention. You're hyper focused on this one object. That is one system that is canceling out outside noise and helping you focus and zone in on this one proximal thing. And the other system is taking you away. It's making you realize everything else. It's keeping you aware of tragic, or keeping you aware of danger behind you, in front of you, or wherever. Your phone buzzing is pulling your attention away. And these two systems work hand in hand in that opponent processor way that is constantly forming and reforming and reorganizing itself to understand and to interpret the reality in front of you. So one definition of consciousness is the system that is the foundational contradictual system that is pulling itself away from reality and drawing you towards reality itself. I know this is a very complex topic, and I may sound like a schizophrenic patient because this is a very complex topic. And if we understood what consciousness was, then I would be smarter than Albert Einstein, but I'm not. So the reason why we're talking about these things, the reason why we're talking about consciousness and reality, is because if we don't know what these things are, we don't have a grasp on them, that leaves the door wide open for lies. It leaves the door wide open for deception. It leaves the door wide open to it's better to be confused about something than to completely ignore its existence. You want to be tailored towards being comfortable with confusion, comfortable with quasi stability, rather than just completely just doing away with the whole entire thing itself. Because where did that leave you? Just complete chaos. There's no roadmap. So we covered reality, we covered consciousness. I'm sorry, we're moving fast here. I want to get to truth. Truth is a funny thing. What is true? I think truth is the combination of consciousness and reality itself. We talk about this meaning of truth, this meaning of the logos, the thing that ties, that binds the reality, that binds the outside reality itself. It encapsulates that, and it encapsulates that opponent processing system we were talking about, the consciousness, the ability to obtain something. And what truth is, what the logos is You could think about it as the eternal spirit that allows reality and consciousness to operate, for something to be true. Not in a pragmatic sense that, this table is holding up my computer and my cards and my coffee and my water, so therefore it's a good table. Not in that sense, but something that in a deeper sense, because truth has to explain deeper things. Why am I putting my computer or my notes on the table? Why am I doing that? Well, because I have to I have to use it for something. Well, what are you using it for? Well, I'm having a lecture series, well-rounded fool, an exploration of atrocity. Subscribe. Why are you doing that? Well, I'm curious. I want to know, the fundamental realities, what consciousness is, why we have truth, why these things are a necessity for life, because if we don't know these things, then they become corrupt, and that leaves the door wide open for people to claim that they understand that we don't need these things, so they can insert ideology itself, so they can plague millions of people, so they can spread their hate, they can spread their resentment. Well, why do you care about all that stuff? So truth has to explain. There is a moral presupposition in truth, that there has to be a moral presupposition in these deeper levels of our life that science itself cannot explain. That science itself cannot. It should have no say in that, because science can only tell us what is. A scientific process can only tell you the bare facts. This is the table. That is a coffee. That is a water bottle. It cannot tell you the essence of this thing. I can break this down. I can say, okay, well, it's a combination of water and coffee beans. I can say this water bottle is a combination of random plastics and H2O. I can break down the chemistry, the molecules of the water, but it can never tell me its essence. It can never tell me why it's there. It can never tell me what the meaning of its existence. So you can think of truth as the spirit that combines purpose with existence. I think that's a very good proposition to make. Who knows? We'll see later in this series. So why are we talking about all this stuff? Why are we talking about truth? Why are we talking about reality? Why are we talking about consciousness? Because a well-rounded fool believes that he can take reality, consciousness, and truth itself and distort it. The well-rounded fool believes that he can take these deep, meaningful, intrinsic parts of reality, consciousness, and truth itself. He can consume those three things, and he doesn't need to bind himself with the process of truth. He doesn't need to bind himself with the process of reality. He doesn't need to bind himself to the confines of what consciousness is. He believes he can step outside of that into consume it, step outside of it, and use it towards his own political or ideological framework. We're talking about these things because the argument here is that the well-rounded fool believes that he is above reality, truth, and consciousness itself. The well-rounded fool is the archetype, is the spirit in which you inhabit when you think you can pull a fast one, where you can get away, when you can escape either three of these systems that we're talking about, these existences that we're speaking about. You have to understand something. You could ask yourself, what's necessary to lie to someone? So truth, we're going to take truth. What is a lie? Well, the opposite of truth. Why do you think you can lie to someone? What do you have to do? Well, you have to first distort the truth. You have to actually tell yourself that this lie is better than the truth. You have to distort reality because, well, you're saying you did that thing, but you actually didn't do that thing. And I think worst of all, probably truth, maybe this is like a competition here, but probably you have to distort your entire consciousness itself. You have to distort the system in which you value those two systems. You have to distort the system itself. That's the best way I can put it. You have to distort that level of consciousness. And we talked about in the first episode that great quote by Solzhenitsyn. Any human being cannot commit evil until he convinces himself the way he's doing is good. In that process of embodying this archetype, embodying this spirit that thinks that you can tweak with this stuff, you have to distort all three of these domains simultaneously. Why would you do that? What's the point? What's the purpose in that? To get a certain means, to obtain something you ought not to obtain, to push a particular agenda you ought not to push. These things are the fabrics of reality itself. And the well-rounded fool believes that he can escape these things. He feels as if he can say this a certain way, if he can distract you from the truth. That's another great Ravakian quote. When he was quoting that book on bullshit. I have to read that book because it sounds very interesting. Because a person who is bullshitting you in a technical sense, he is relying on your commitment to the truth to bullshit you, to deceive you. You have to rely to deceive someone. You have to rely on their commitment to truth. So for instance, if I'm a politician, I'm trying to push my own agenda. I'm trying to say that, this X, Y, and Z plan is gonna fund, it's gonna create thousands of jobs, it's going to eliminate this cause, and we're gonna be just a big happy family. I have to for that message to stick. I have to do a combination of three things. I have to, number one, assuming that this plan is bullshit, assuming this plan doesn't actually work, assuming that this plan will not only not work, but have the complete opposite effect. We're gonna lose jobs with this plan. We're going to lose money with this plan. Assuming this thing is not true. But in order for me to sell this to you, I have to do a number of things. Number one, I have to rely on your commitment to truth. So I have to exploit that deep wanting for you to believe the words that are coming out of my mouth. Because we just kind of think that, if someone tells you something, well, I'm not just going to think just off the cuff that that's a lie. I'm not, that's a terrible way of thinking. And that's a terrible way of thinking that actually rose in the 20th century. Everything you just say, free speech itself is just like a facade to excel yourself instrumentally throughout the world. If someone says, hey, that's nice shoes you got there, I'm not just gonna think, well, he's just telling me that because he wants to be friends with me so that he can take my money, so he can take my connections, so that he can just pathologically and just parasitically just eat off of me and then take my resources and then just go away. Like that. That's such a twisted way of thinking. And people don't think like that. Well, most people don't think like that. Most people are saying, hey, well, he said my shoes are nice. Hey, that was a nice thing for him to say. I am binding myself to what this person says is true. You let people be innocent before they're proven guilty. That's another great quote by Nietzsche. He said, it's a really, really, really great quote by Friedrich Nietzsche. He said, I'm not mad that you lied to me. I'm mad that I can no longer trust you. And that's such a great quote. I'm not mad that you didn't like my shoes. I'm now mad that you stepped outside of that framework of people that I can trust. You stepped outside of the group of that tiny group of people who I could somewhat believe that they're trying their best to approximate themselves to something that looks like the truth. You stepped outside that box, and now I have to throw you away. You exploited my commitment to truth. You exploited my reality. You exploited my consciousness itself. That's a brilliant quote because it takes off it's not naive. It's like, well, if you didn't like my shoes, if you didn't like them, maybe you're just being nice. Maybe you were just you felt like complimenting someone today. And that's not really deception. That could just be you trying. Maybe I seen that you had a frown. Maybe you're looking down. I just wanted to, give you a compliment. I'm not worried about that. Nietzsche wasn't worried about that. He was more worried about these deeper topics we're speaking about. You exploiting my reality. You exploiting my sense of truth. You exploiting my consciousness itself. You're doing all that simultaneously when you lie to someone. And you also can't lie to someone without first lying to yourself. You have to lie to yourself first before you lie to someone else. So you ask yourself, which one is worse? To go back into reality, consciousness, and perception, we're going to start with one of my favorite Enlightenment thinkers. We're going to briefly touch on them. We're going to start on Kant. Immanuel Kant. He was one of the Enlightenment thinkers. He was after David Hume. We're going to speak about David Hume as well. I like Kant, and I think Kant is I'll say this first before we talk about Kant. If you do not read Immanuel Kant, if you have not read his critique of pure reason, if you have not read his critique of judgment, if you have not read his critique of pure judgment, or whatever the hell the third one was, if you have not read those things, or Logic, one of my favorite ones, I reviewed that book, you can read it right here. If you have not read any of those things, you are out the debate. You cannot be in the cultural debate. You cannot be in a debate about physics. You can't be in a debate about consciousness. You can't be in a debate about philosophy. You can't be in a debate about sports teams. I don't care what it is. If you have not read Kant, you are fundamentally ignorant on the bait. Like, you're not even in the, like, I don't even know how you can even feel comfortable opining on a subject if you don't understand what Kant was, his significance in the culture. You can't understand it. He's the basis of a fundamental thinker in Western thinking. That's like saying you're a soccer sports team, but you don't know who Cristiano Ronaldo is, or you don't know who Wayne Rooney is. It's like you're just not even, you just be jettisoning the side. You're not even serious. So why Kant is important is because he was first of all a phenomenal thinker, but second, he was obsessed with these things we're talking about. He was obsessed with reality. He was obsessed with truth, and he was obsessed with consciousness. And he was a very different thinker, because despite him being an Enlightenment thinker, and he would wrestle with God. He would wrestle with the idea of the divine. He would wrestle with those. Not too sure to call him definitely wasn't a conservative Christian at all. But he did wrestle with the idea of the divine for them. He tried to rationalize an existence for a God, but I don't think it's appropriate to call him religious. But he was obsessed with these ideas of truth, of perception and knowledge itself. He was obsessed with this. And one of the key things, and him and David Hume's work go along so good. One of the key things that he pointed out was, in his critique of pure reason, is that in order to view the world, so to use your consciousness to understand reality, in order to even participate in this process, it requires an a priori moral judgment. So what is an a priori moral judgment? What is that? Well, why use consciousness? Why care about truth? Why participate in the world? You see, the very action of you participating in the world presupposes a moral judgment. And then he's one of the first people who critiqued that and who pointed that out, because we like to think, because pre-Kant, we just thought that, and during this enlightenment era, we just thought that things are what they are, and what we do is we impose, in a romantic sense, we impose our values on the objective world. We impose ourselves on outside phenomena, and those two things in a way don't really touch. Something that Martin Heidegger pointed out was, he thought as if the subjects and objects had this relationship with the phanestai. So phanestai is the things that the things themselves shine forth. They shine forth their meaning. They shine forth their essence, in a way, in an Aristotelian Platonic way, and they announce themselves. And us, the subjects, we came into this union with the objects. But there's a hole in that too, because who is instructing? What is my perceptions being guided by? Is there a moral interpretation of this? if I'm seeing a $20 bill laying on the ground, what is what is making me not think of that thing as something to level up a table? What is not compelling me to think of this wallet on the ground? Why can I use that to prop up one of the desks? Why can I use that to scratch an itch on my back? Why can I use that to put in my pocket? There is a infinite amount of interpretations, and there's something else that he pointed out too. There's an infinite amount of interpretations. So what is guiding my thoughts to look at, to perceive the world and to use these objects around me? What is guiding that? There's a big hole there. Well, what is it? Well, do we fill that hole with some romantic sense, or do we have a intrinsic moral system that is binding those two things, that is binding the reality and consciousness itself? Truth being that intermediary structure that Kant was talking about. So he's an essential thinker, he's an essential figure and spokesperson for truth, reality, and consciousness itself, because those things are fundamental, man. It's like if you don't have a solid theory on that, you have a gaping hole. You just have a gaping hole in your perception itself. We're going to read his quote by Immanuel Kant, if I can find it. Ready to go. I guess I'll just cut this part out. There we go. You have a gaping hole in your theory. This is from Kant speaking. This is Kant speaking. Everything intuited in space or time, and therefore all objects of experience possible to us, are nothing but appearances, that is, mere representations, which in the manner in which they are represented in extended beings or series of alterations, have no independent existence outside our thoughts. Have no independent existence outside our thoughts. So what Kant here is describing, he is describing the plain world, the objective reality itself. These things have no existence outside of our thoughts, because what is necessary for us to, and it's so hard to understand this, because there's Judeo-Christian presuppositions that are packed into Enlightenment thinkers' quotes, into scientists' quotes as well, because Earth and humans have this, people like to, the scientific mind abstracts, the scientific mind, the hyper scientific mind separates things from its habitat, it separates things from its intrinsic worth. The Earth and humans are one in what these radical environmentalists like to think of, and you hear people say the most pathological, twisted things ever, like human beings are parasites on Earth, or we need to take care of the Earth as if we're subordinate to our environments, or some weird things that are packed in there. Because it's like, well, why are you separating human beings from the Earth? Why are you separating those two things? What makes you think that those things are not one? And when we talk about our perceptions, we are, this is everything. This Earth, the air, the people, the grass, the trees, the plants, the animals, the human beings, we are one. We are encapsulated in one thing. There is no objects in a Hegelian sense competing for dominant purpose. And when people say things like, "Oh, the Earth will be better without humans," or "We need to take care of Mother Earth. We need to subordinate ourselves in this Gaia form that, we better watch our step, or don't pull that branch too hard, or Mother Nature's gonna get mad." It's you're making human beings subordinate to something that they are already in. This is one thing. And what Kant is pointing out is that there is no existence outside of our thoughts. things just in themselves have no meaning, that if they're outside our thoughts. What is the purpose of something being there? How do we know that thing is even there if no one is there to witness it? So there's certain presuppositions that are packed in there. Perhaps humans and the earth were made at once. Maybe there is a purpose for humans and for the existence to be there in a harmonious way. Maybe there was a purpose in that. And I believe that he's saying that there is a purpose, there is an intrinsic purpose to humans having the ability to observe something itself. All objections to morality and religion will forever be silenced, and this in a Socratic fashion, namely by the clearest proof of the ignorance of the objectors. All objections to morality and religion will forever be silenced, and this in a Socratic fashion, namely by the clearest proof of ignorance of the objectors. So right there, Kant is saying that all claims of morality and judgment are to be silenced, because, well, who are you in your white coat to determine what ought to be and what not, if all you have by your side is a system that can only tell you what is? You have no room. Kant said you had no room to make any moral or metaphysical judgments on reality if your system itself doesn't have a purpose, doesn't account for the purpose of it. And one of the things that I really like about Kant is that he's not scared to call out these sciences. Even though he was a scientific thinker of part of the Enlightenment, he's not scared to call out these misconceptions we have about reality. So the significance here, the significance of understanding reality, truth, and consciousness itself, how this ties to well-rounded fool, how this ties to the exploration of atrocity, how it ties into how these things are intrinsically important to reality. It's because the well-rounded fool does not have a moralistic binding to reality itself. A well-rounded fool does not bind himself objectively to truth. The well-rounded fool does not morally, in an intrinsic, a priori way, bind himself to his own consciousness itself. Because to distort your consciousness is to distort reality and distort truth. To distort truth is to distort your consciousness so that you can destroy reality. And to destroy reality is to distort your consciousness so that you can destroy truth. These things are a trinity of one, and they are packed into one. And the well-rounded fool believes that he can do away with that, fool someone else to promote his own entire existence, to make his own being, to be a god himself. Are you that person who is going to distort reality, distort truth, distort the consciousness, distort the fundamental mechanisms that allow things to exist? Are you going to be that person that does that? Who the hell are you to do that? Another popular biblical story that Jordan Peterson popularized. Well, in recent years, he didn't popularize the story to be, but it's being Cain. It's thinking that you can get away with it. Am I my brother's keeper? When God asked Cain, where is your brother Abel? He said, am I my brother's keeper? To think you can surpass reality, to think you can do away with truth, and to think that you can distort your entire consciousness is the precursor to thinking you can be God himself. Next week, we're going to go deeper into consciousness, deeper into reality, deeper into truth. We're going to talk more about David Hume, and we're going to introduce perception. We're going to introduce deception, and how these are fundamental realities that embed reality, truth, and consciousness himself. And after that, we're going to discuss lengthy the idea of perceiving the world in a moralistic way. We're going to go further into Kant and eventually discuss how these ideas became parasitized during the 20th century with ideas of the post-structural movement, postmodernism, Marxism, and other ideologies that formed from people distorting reality, truth, and consciousness itself. So thank you for watching, and I appreciate your time. We'll see you next week.